right. Well, Samir, I'm thrilled that you're here with me today. We have a lot that we're going to dig into, but before we get there, we want to learn a little bit more about you. Can you just introduce yourself and your background a little bit for my audience?
Absolutely. And Kelly, thank you for having me. I'm Samir Kapadia. I'm a managing principal at a lobbying and trade organization here in Washington, D.C. called Vogel Group. And I also serve as the founder and CEO of a B2B marketplace called India Index, which helps U.S. companies source from India. So I've been doing this for about 10 to 15 years in the supply chain world, and excited to tell you a little bit about India.
Now, I'm interested in the fact that you have experience as a lobbyist. I'll tell you, you're my first lobbyist that I've ever talked to.
Hopefully one of the
Yeah. But I'm interested in what that role is like, sort of, at least from my perspective, sitting in the spot between government and private industry. What would you say your perspective is like sitting in that middle spot?
Well, it's a unique one to say the least when it comes to trade. And that's because the whole narrative of trade in Washington has transformed dramatically since 2015, 2016, and accelerated even further in 2018, where Republicans, which used to be the party of free trade agreements, now are about as restrictionist and isolationist as you can imagine. And Democrats, who often espouse similar mindsets around aligning with like-minded nations, democratic nations for trade, they also have gone super, super pro-union to the point where they're also restricting and limiting all kinds of things for companies that have global supply chains. And so it's a pretty remarkable time to be in the lobbying business and also be a trade guy. And that's mainly because it's not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. It's an American issue. America writ large is looking to restrict the way that companies do business abroad. And so the line of sight that I have into not just the Fortune 500, but into the more smaller companies and how they're navigating these issues is super compelling. And it culminated to the point where in 2019 and in 2020, I was ranked the #1 lobbyist in Washington when it came to tariff cases and trying to get companies exemptions. And so I've been around the block a few times, and I can say that it only keeps getting more exciting for folks like me, but for companies, it's just getting worse.
Yeah, and it's certainly not a simple situation. I actually love the fact that you bring up, let's say, maybe the lack of distinction on this topic between Republicans and Democrats. I was actually having a similar conversation earlier today with somebody else where, despite the rhetoric and the traditional thinking and the way most of us as voters and private citizens tend to think about the positioning of these parties, if you actually look at policy, not an enormous amount of difference. Lots of other areas, yes. But where tariffs in particular are concerned, maybe this is something that could actually unite the country and bring us all together. You never know, Samir.
I wouldn't put it past the American people to want to support domestic manufacturing, of course. Where it can get hairy is around government picking winners and losers,
right,
and really determining which sectors should be protected and which sectors maybe shouldn't. And that list has gotten pretty wide, whether it was the solar tariffs under Section 201 or the steel tariffs under Section 232 to the sweeping Chinese tariffs we had under Section 301, now accelerating into conversations around forced labor and now potentially more environmental standards as it relates to the suitability test for imports. It seems that the layers that are being thrown up as these eligibility tests for countries to actively participate in our economy, there are no bounds. And so, where does that line eventually be drawn? I don't think any of us know the answer to that question.
Absolutely. Well, and we've already gotten to it. You sort of said the magic word in your explanation there, but you can't talk about supply chains or trade without talking about China. And certainly for a long time, but in a very focused way since 2020, we have talked about all of the different versions of X-shoring, right? Nearshoring, friendshoring, all of the alternatives to that, as well as sort of a China plus one type of strategy. But the vast majority of it so far seems to be more talk than action. So I'm curious, from your point of view, Why does China loom so large and have such a strong hold on global supply chains?
Well, it's important to recognize that they've been doing this for a while, right? I mean, 50, 60, 70 years, wherever you want to put that number, of really doing it at a scale where they're participating en masse across all kinds of sectors that are now fundamentals of our consumer-based economy in the United
Yeah.
States. We decided long ago to get out of the working with your hands business. We decided to give it to countries that we thought might be better suited, whether that was because of their labor force or whether their access to cheap labor, or low utility costs, or state-run capitalism, so to speak. And we wanted to get into industries that were a little bit sexier, with a little bit more technology and forward-looking. But then we realized that we actually need all that stuff. And so, what do you really do? So China was taking a large sort of share of that marketplace. I believe they account for 28% of global manufacturing trade. They also are second to the United States in terms of R&D spending, about at $660 billion. They also account for over half of the warehousing in all of the Asia Pacific. And they have one of the busiest and most advanced container ports ecosystems in the world. And so why are they where they are? Well, because they've spent money and time and built expertise to meet a market demand, which we all happily welcomed, whether you're in Europe or in the United States or anywhere else around the world. And so I think they are they're a byproduct of their own hard work, to be truthful. The question is, how is that evolving, and where are these new pockets of supply chain hubs? Where are they coming up, and how successful are they going to be? Because anyone who tells me that China's getting out of this manufacturing game, whether that's through politics or policy or economics, I just don't see it happening. I mean, they really know what they're doing, and they've got the skills and the infrastructure to boot.
No, and it is interesting. I mean, we've heard some mixed messages about their economy more recently, right? And that's certainly going to have an impact on, say, export numbers for them. But we also know that they are continuing to invest, and they're both investing domestically, but they're also investing throughout the region. And in fact, a lot of times, companies that are trying to explore the China plus one strategy actually have a way of ending up at a supplier that has been so heavily invested in by China that it's sort of like China, but within Cambodia, or China, but within Vietnam. To what extent does their investment in other countries make it much harder to achieve the intent of the China plus one strategy?
It's a brilliant point you bring up. And, a lot of companies, I think, not just European or American, have tried to look the other way when they see these sort of leapfrogging of companies from China homeland over to, say, a place like Vietnam, a country which heralds its relationship with China as both a financing partner and a technology partner, what have you. I think that there's just going to be more government oversight when it comes to these kinds of relationships. And all the meanwhile, if you walk through the halls of the U.S. Department of Commerce and speak to those with the International Trade Administration, they are not at all alarmed or caught by surprise to any of these narratives. Whether you look at the solar industry in particular, or things even within the semiconductor industry, when you look into the supply chain and you look at who actually owns these assets and owns these companies, that it all links back to Beijing. And so what does that really do? You're a U.S. importer. You're trying to find a viable supplier in another country. And all the meanwhile, you're hoping that the Bureau of Industry and Security over at the Department of Commerce isn't going to raise a red flag at you at customs for bringing in a product when you say it's actually made in X country when not made by Y country.
Right.
I think that the United States government is very familiar with what's actually happening. It just comes down to a company's culture. So many companies just, let's just say they have more elasticity in their ways to operate in some of these geographies, which provides them a runway to go and conduct business, whether that's to suit a specific supply chain sprint or whether that's just to stop the pain. But ultimately, it's all going to lead back to oversight, and I think people are going to be on the wrong side of that trade if they continue that practice.
Well, it is interesting to think about the reasons why companies might be trying to move either some of their sourcing or some of their volume out of China, depending on industry. There are certainly different motivators, there are different regulations that come into play. When we last spoke, you had actually mentioned companies that are taking an ABC approach, so anything but China, which is really funny. That's a great acronym. How common is it that companies are literally just throwing up their hands and saying, "Anywhere else, please"?
It's so true that China plus one has become ABC, uh, and that's more certain in Washington than anywhere else. And a lot of folks don't necessarily realize that Washington D.C. has now become the center of global trade policy, and as a result, the place where a lot of decisions are made within the Fortune 500 or even amongst smaller growth stage companies. And what I'm finding is ABC is just as common of a term in Washington as it is common to find a lawyer in this town. That sentiment is so real. And sure, there might be some lip service and some political aspects of why to champion that kind of narrative, whether that's for your shareholders or that's for your customers or that's for your board or that's for your senator or congressman or for your political party. I get it. It is a part of the lip service, but walking through some of the halls and conversations that you might see from the Oval Office to the Senate Rotunda, there is an ABC, fervor that has not ceased, and it's only expanding, and it's evolving into more thematic, more policy related ideas, like say, well, no, we're anything but China because of the environment, or no, we're anywhere but China because of child labor, and you can see how you can really turn ABC into any political argument, whether it's a domestic manufacturing initiative, intellectual property theft, geopolitical security. It's a big tent that everyone feels really comfortable under.
Yeah. And yet it's funny because when I think about it, sort of my initial response to that type of approach is that it sounds emotional. It sounds visceral because certainly I have a background in procurement and supply chain. Anytime you're bringing in a new prospective supplier of something, there's the honeymoon phase. You haven't gotten to see the skeletons in all of their closets yet. If they're big enough, if they've been in business long enough, you just have to find the right closet, right? And so it does seem like maybe there's a little bit of naivete about saying absolutely anything has to be better than China. Are we just swapping sort of what is the expression? The devil you know versus the devil you don't know, right? To say carte blanche across the board, to your point, for human rights reasons, for environmental reasons, potentially even for proximity reasons, absolutely anybody is better than China. And then to try to build a reliable business strategy on that seems like trying to build a house on a rather shaky foundation.
Kelly, as a practitioner, you speak the absolute truth that I've heard from, nearly all of the 200 or so clients I've had in trade and supply chain and tariff issues. You never want to, shoot the gun from the hip of politics. It usually doesn't work, and if it does, it won't last. There has to be a business rationale as to how you're looking at diverting supply chains, whether that's finding that skill gap arbitrage, or that's finding that preferred pricing structure, or whether that's finding a better quality or better roadmap for how you then want to access that domestic market for maybe potential sales and finding synergies therein. The point is there's 100% a boogeyman type approach right now to the way that people look at China. What I think companies have to give caution to is, how can you still show that you're looking at diversification without fully exiting China in one fell swoop? Now, don't get me wrong. I've worked with many companies that have fully exited China on a variety of different platforms or widgets or commodities, everything from motors for consumer appliances to gemstones and other aspects of the affordable jewelry segment. to even things like wiring harnesses for automobiles. The point is, sure, you can go and find it, but how long will it take you, and are you able to
Right.
find that with a sense of veracity and volume that can make your business model work? You can't do it just because some senator sent you a mean letter. And look, those aren't very fun either.
Yeah.
We don't like to be called out. But when these things turn into legislation and turn into executive orders and turn into mandates from the United States Trade Representative, you got a problem. And so that's why you got to pay attention to these things.
Well, and so what we're going to move on and actually talk about now is, instead of saying anywhere but China, right? Let's think constructively about some of the viable alternatives. And one of the alternatives that I know you have experience with and expertise in is looking at India as a replacement for all or some of the sourcing and manufacturing that companies are doing in China. Why is India an attractive alternative for a lot of companies that are trying to move out of China?
Well, the first reason really is because the country's gone through a dramatic state of reform under the current leadership. They've, increased the level of infrastructure, not just hardline infrastructure like roads and bridges and highway systems and ports, but also digital infrastructure, things like
Mm,
wireless technology and communications platforms, and ways to kind of integrate systems in manners that just weren't there 10 years ago. And so everyone's kind of looking back around and saying, hey, this place looks kind of different. And I think that's what's really exciting people. It's not so much the politics. It's just that it's a different country, and they're going through rapid urbanization and urban planning and all kinds of system upgrades that folks from Dell to HP to Nike to Hasbro to Sony to Apple to Google to Goldman, they're all looking back at India and saying, let's go double down, triple down, and build a presence here. And I think it's not so much a byproduct of, hey, I'm just going to come here because I can get, relatively cheap labor and good access to, commodities and other kinds of product segments to China plus one, my supply chain work. But it's also because, you know what, I kind of want the Indian consumer to be my consumer. And there's two sides of the coin that you necessarily don't find at scale
mm,
in other countries. And so while maybe people say, well, look at what the Philippines is doing and look what Vietnam's doing and look what some of these other countries are doing, they're actually going to take the lion's share because they have more legacy operations in things like consumer electronics or in things like apparel and garments and footwear. Okay, fine. But you tell me, you're a CEO, you make a widget or you make a consumer product, you want to sell a lot of it. Where do you want to build that brand equity? Where do you want to build that base to go and cater to a country of 1.4 billion people, only growing, where half of the population is under the age of 25? I mean, these are going to be
yeah.
50-year consumers for you if you do it right. And so I think that's that long-termism, despite the short-term benefits, is what's really driving corporate behavior that we've seen over the past 12 to 18 months.
Now, I'd be curious to know a little bit more about India's strategy to investing in this development, right? So you talked about both traditional and digital infrastructure, skills, and of course, it's a very attractive consumer market. To what extent is India saying, China's like the bad guy in the room? There's an opportunity here for us to sort of come in and take the role that they've held, versus India looking at the overall situation and saying, we think that there's a huge opportunity here for us, but it might not be an exact footprint of what China's done in the past. We think we can do something slightly different.
Mm.
How are they focusing on developing their capabilities through the investments that they're making?
It's a terrific question because it bifurcates the kinds of conversations that are happening in Delhi to Mumbai to Bangalore, which is, where does India want to compete? And remember, capital is limited. This is relatively a poor country. Yeah, sure, they're have one of the highest, if not the highest, GDP growth rate in the world. They are the largest democracy in the world. They have the youngest and most vibrant population that could be the next labor force of the globe, in the world. They have all of these brilliant kinds of tailwinds, but they don't have much money. Okay, I mean, they need companies to come in and invest, and if you build it, they will come type scenarios. And that's where you see this bifurcation, as I've mentioned, in thought process, which is, do we want to spend all of our efforts competing with China and Vietnam to capture things like machinery and apparel, and footwear, and consumer electronics, and kind of get that market share incrementally in a couple, tens of millions of dollars, $50 million, $100 million, $300 million. Okay, now $1 billion. Like, how do we do that and do it kind of piecemeal? I think that's really hard to do. Yeah. And I actually don't think that that's going to be the strategy of India Co. It's really on the other side of the coin, as I've talked about these two kind of conversations in Washington, in Delhi, where they're spending their attention, which is, let's leave all the incremental stuff to wherever we can get it. If we can get it, fantastic. If we can't, let's not worry about it. Let's instead go for something so big ticket and so transformational that it can actually keep pace with the kind of chip stack that we have right now as a country to the world. And that's going to be things like semiconductors, advanced aerospace and defense technology, and even in very nascent but growing industries like critical minerals. Okay. That's where India kind of sees that longer term vector of growth. And if they're able to do that, right, and that's a huge long shot, it could serve as such a catalyst for meeting a lot of the inequities that the country has. Because while I talked about this huge labor pool, they're not skilled. They don't meet a lot of the requirements that people need, that, say, China's really built on. Now, will they get there? Sure, they'll get there. But you need industries that are kind of big tent industries, go in and train them up, so then everything kind of fills in on the downstream. So I think that's where you're seeing this lean into India going for big ticket as opposed to small ticket as a much more strategic long-term vision for the country.
Now, when you talk about that long-term development and the long-term opportunity that goes with it, let's sort of baseline things. How would you say India's costs and capabilities and capacity even compared to what companies are used to getting in China and potentially even other Asian countries today?
So on a labor basis, you're going to find India to be competitive with China, in some cases even lower, depending upon what sector and what kind of specifications that a company might need for their products. But there's just a higher cost of doing business there, that in some regards that I think people are going to give people some pause. And that's going to be around sort of two main areas that are also, oddly enough, jointly related. First is going to be just your red tape, your compliance. The tax structure there is highly convoluted. Getting things done like meeting all of the various standards and getting all the approvals and certifications from the right governmental bodies is an incredibly cumbersome, costly from a legal perspective, and opportunity cost perspective, just workflow. Like you need to bear that brunt, and that's going to take you time, and you need to find local partners to help you. And sometimes they don't always end up successful. The second is around, so as I said, a jointly related subject matter, which is around land. I mean, getting access to land, whether that's through availability or actually acquisition, can be fraught with challenges. I was working with a Fortune 1000 company not too long ago that was having that had over 30 years of operations in India, and they still didn't own the land of their factory.
Oh, wow.
And I'm just like, are you kidding me? And so these are the things where you got to have a stomach for it. And some companies, and I've talked to a lot of them, they don't have the stomach for it. But what I found as a good hack is just do a joint venture. Just don't go in alone. Or just go with straight up contract manufacturing relationships. That's gonna and do that for a while, and then when you feel really comfortable, go do a joint venture and get it done. I don't tell people to go, plant their flag in India without having any friends or any
Yeah.
process or any stomach for the challenges. Now, granted, those processes have gotten a lot better than they were 10 years ago, but it's still a process. So we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah. Now, you also talked about some of the current shortages of capital in India. And it actually takes me back to the part of our conversation where we talked about people thinking they're diversifying from China and ending up with Chinese suppliers in Chinese factories just in different country borders. What is India's perspective on foreign investment? So I guess what I'm asking very directly is,
Yeah.
does India's need for capital and China's willingness to spend and buy up space create exactly the same situation we're trying to get away from in Vietnam, Cambodia, in India?
So it comes down to this. India's going to need more so than capital, the intellectual property and skill-based systems to move quickly in getting into some of these fundamental sectors. We've seen this within, for instance, the EV battery supply chain, where you have large-scale potential announcements of investments within India's EV ecosystem. Elon Musk saying, you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to consider doing it. But as a result, there then are revelations that actually the business model doesn't really work in India unless, if say, you reduce some of the tariffs on the input materials that
Okay.
come in, or actually we need to bring in this specific IP from another nation, which might not be allied, to make this actually accelerate at a pace that makes it economical. And so I think you're going to find on a case-by-case basis, India being willing to partner with Chinese companies where it makes sense. I think that's largely going to be for consumer-focused industries that are green tech related and renewable energy related. I don't see that same symbiosis as it relates to things like defense and aerospace, because
Okay.
that just doesn't jive. So,
Yeah.
for instance, one of India's fastest growing sectors is the drone industry. In no way do I ever see a Chinese drone company being allowed in any shape or form to be participating in the Indian drone sector. I
Okay.
don't see it happening. And that's because of a variety of challenges around data security, around the technology transfer issues, and things like surveillance, among other things. For a country that has a lot of borders, I don't think India wants to be sharing that tech with a lot of countries. The point being is, we're going to have some of these case by case analyses where India's going to say, I don't care if it allows me to go sell a moped or a two-wheeler or a really cheap sedan to an Indian consumer that's now going to be polluting less into these urban populations. Okay, like fine, we need some Chinese tech to do that. Let's do it. But there's going to be some places where they're going to say, I don't think that's going to work. So, and all those decisions are going to be coming from Delhi, nowhere else.
Yeah. Now, since you brought up EVs, the other thing we have to think about in any of these supply chains, because they do, in fact, a lot of times go all the way back to the raw materials, and the rawest of the raw materials is in the case of rare earth minerals, for instance, that are used in some of these EV batteries. Some of it's luck. It just happens to be within their borders. Some of it is they are willing to mine for it in a way that other parts of the world that also have access to those minerals are not willing to mine, or not willing to mine in that location. That does serve as part of China's advantage. Does India have a plan for how to handle the cases where they can maybe do the processing or the manufacturing or further downstream processes, but they don't necessarily have access to those raw minerals that China does?
And this is probably one of the hottest subjects right now when it comes to geopolitics and supply chain. Whether you're at Davos or whether you're on Pennsylvania Avenue, everyone is very consumed with how do you go and secure these critical rare earth minerals as a way not just to diversify away from what is clearly a monopoly that China has, whether it's on nickel, cobalt, lithium, what have you, but to also say, how do we collect all these things to support renewable energy transition projects and defense platforms, among the like. We need these things, and we realize that we don't have these things without one country, and that's China. So I think India is now cautiously but methodically looking at how they approach their reserves. It's been uncovered just in the last year that India has the world's 5th largest reserves for rare earth minerals. It's all just sitting under that land. India does have a robust mining sector, but they do rely on a lot of other countries for technologies and for skills to do that at a fast enough clip to bring those to market in areas like electric vehicles. For instance, coal mining and iron ore and things that are what I call legacy industrial businesses, India can do, but I don't think necessarily that they are as equipped with getting into things like refining of cobalt or nickel or lithium. And they admittedly say so. So what are they doing? Well, they're offering up those reserves in auctions to say, hey, come one, come all, come invest over here. We'll work out some framework of a joint venture type agreement with a partner that we've selected, whether that's a Tata or whether that's an Epsilon or a JSW or a Birla or Adani. And we'll say, hey, work with these guys and we'll make your life a little easier. But here's going to be the economics on that. We're just in the beginning days of it. I think India has a brilliant path forward on that, but that is incredibly capital intensive. And so as I'm looking at the ecosystem of where companies are placing their bets, I think we're very much in the beginning stages of that. And to your point, Kelly, we might find more synergies in the downstream, say, refining piece of it, and then just say, hey, India, you figure out how to get it out of the ground. I'm not going to be in that messy business. It's going to cost me entirely too much money, take entirely too much time. And the labor concerns are really actually freaking me out. So you go and do that on your own. And then when you get it all and put it in a warehouse, great, call me. I'll help you refine it. And by the way, I'm going to take 50% of it. Like, I think that's a much more viable path. And we might be getting there, Kelly. I mean, just in the past year, India got onto the U.S. State Department's Mineral Security Partnership list, which is a huge win. They were never on that list. They just got on it. And so I think countries are looking at it and evaluating it. Early stages, but to your point, the value is really going to be on the downstream, not on the upstream.
Well, and this was something that you had raised when we spoke previously, and I think it's a really interesting to think about. Certainly, there's the cost and there's the anticipated ROI, but there's all of those, like you've talked about, companies having or not having the stomach for something. I think the closer you get back to ground, quite literally, a lot of that appetite and stomach starts to fall away. And so it is going to be one of the things that other companies need to think about. Where back along the supply chain does the comfort levels start to wane in comparison to the ROI? It'll be interesting to see over time where different firms start to draw the line around what they see as the benefit to them around access versus when they'd rather say, we're just not going to look. Right? Do what you need to do. Tell us you're being compliant. Do your very best to also be compliant, but don't put our logo on that equipment. Don't put our logo on that sign at a mine. I think that's going to be something that's going to be interesting to watch.
Without question. The good news is that India does espouse a number of great virtues when it comes to labor practices that you just don't find in non-democratic nations. And so I think that there's certainly pathways. And remember, India has a mob mentality where there's a lot of mob justice. And when they see companies and executives act in manners that are not appropriate or to the disadvantage of the common, average, Indian, they take action. And they make sure that that there is what I call public justice around what occurs. Once again, you don't see that in other countries that might be viewed as a competitive alternative or a growing competitive alternative. So I think that the DNA of India does create a sense of confidence for international markets and for international companies that are seeking to find a regional trade partner or a manufacturing partner. They have all of the right features of what could be a brilliant long-term partner. The question is, How quickly can they start rolling back these regulations? How swiftly can they start putting in incentive structures to make the economics work? And then can they train their labor force and leapfrog on that skill gap to make those operations productive? We don't know that. And if that can happen, and from what we're gathering from the marketplace, look, when Apple comes in, they're not screwing around. Like Apple's training, they're figuring it out. They're building the sort of roadways, as it were, for other companies to come in after them. And so I think people are incredibly impressed with the names that have signed up to India Co. just in the past 2 years. I think that list is going to double. And so because now it's not the path of least resistance. It's why don't I have an India presence? And that's when everyone's going to realize they're in the back of the line, and all the smart money saying, let's make sure that we at least have a seat at that table.
Well, and I imagine, like with anything else, there's a tipping point, right? There's a few very large, very recognizable companies where it doesn't really matter what sector you're actually in. If companies like Apple are willing to go and invest there and put time on, everybody else starts to go, okay, maybe I should give that another look. Now, you and I got the conversation started today, as increasingly happens these days. You go right to politics. Sure. It's almost impossible to avoid right now with November looming so large. But one thing I'll include myself in this, most Americans don't know a ton about, is the political landscape in India. Now, I know that Indian Prime Minister Modi was just reelected for a third 5-year term. What policies or priorities or business conditions even does that mean are likely to be in place for the next 5 years?
Well, we can safely imagine him to be doubling down on what I call this infrastructure 2.0 agenda, which is by building all of these hardline and softline, infrastructure systems, it is creating a sense of confidence for foreign direct investment. So that we can say will continue. Tens of thousands of new highway systems. And I think what's really exciting is what I will believe will be the biggest renaissance in the ports ecosystem in India. India has a shortage of ports. And now we're seeing all of the other kinds of frameworks put into place where once that capital goes out and it's deployed, and India has the steel, it has the wherewithal, it has the labor to build these ports out at a scale which can bring confidence to importers and exporters all around the world. I think that's going to be really a priority number one for the next 5 years. Following that, there are some challenges to the Modi administration. We saw that in this previous cycle, that he didn't have the clean sweep that many were really imagining, and that he had to assume leadership through what they call a coalition government, which is, hey, it's me and my 2 other political parties that I am aligned with. We're going to assume the leadership role together, which some can, examine and determine whether or not that's still Modi, a coalition government in name only, or is that a kind of mutual sympathy of sentiments between like-minded parties that are just trying to govern as a unit. From what I'm gathering, just in the past few weeks since he's come into office, and in the months, and what I believe will be in the months ahead, is that there is domestic competition when it comes to Mr. Modi's political agenda. Now, while everyone is on the side of pro-growth and India leadership around the world and infrastructure 2.0 and all these other matters, India's got a lot of legacy challenges when it comes to sectors of that they deem to be critical, like the farming sector. And there's some inequities on how people look at that sector and how they look at subsidies and how they look at certain support systems. So I think where we're going to see some challenge, I wouldn't even really call it challenges, I would call it friction, is around his domestic policy agenda. I think everyone will agree on the foreign piece, but on the domestic side, because there's just more of an opposition now under the Congress party led by Mr. Rahul Gandhi, that might kind of continue to nip at his heels and make things a little bit more challenging and with a little bit more friction. But as long as Prime Minister Modi aligns himself to a pro-growth head of state, a global leader, head of state. On our last conversation, Kelly, I told you I had the opportunity to see Mr. Modi speak at the joint address before Congress, and as I was sitting there in the House of Representatives in the gallery, and I looked down and saw Mr. Modi speak, and when he concluded his speech, there were over 100 different senators and congressmen that were waiting in line to take a selfie with Prime Minister Modi.
Interesting.
And you just don't see that. Like, they don't do that for the Queen of England, or in this case, the King of England. The point I'm making is there is a certain celebrity and a certain respect that the current administration in India has created around the idea of India Co. And if he can continue to kind of guide people along that pathway, while keeping a clear mind on, say, the quality of life for the average Indian farmer or textile worker or another a high intensive labor type job, he can manage through it. And I think he's doing so right now. And that's just empirical evidence, not normative.
Well, and especially today, it's interesting because we talked about infrastructure traditionally, and we talked about infrastructure digitally. In a post-Russia invasion of Ukraine world, where we saw a lot of companies, whether they had operations in Ukraine or whether they had businesses or partnerships in Russia, sort of corporations needing to figure out, where do we stand in this geopolitical context. It would actually be interesting to see Modi's relative successor on his domestic policy become like another type of infrastructure. I mean, certainly in the abstract, but back to that idea of stomach and appetite, his relative success and how it's received and the progress he's able to make and how well it goes. You could almost see brands watching that to see, okay, how happy are people in these different, especially labor-based industries in India? And maybe that changes their appetite, pro or con, as we have a little bit more time go by.
You're right. And I think, certainty around policy is very helpful, not just in places like India, but definitely in places like the United States and Europe. And so you can imagine how that sentiment rises even higher in places like, where you haven't done much business and you're just sorted out. You bring up the Russia point, and that's a particularly striking one, because I think it pokes at one of the questions that a lot of companies and countries have around India, which is, where do they, when you quote unquote need them to fall in line on a global issue, do they always kind of sit on the right side of history, or do they always kind of align with overall consensus? Now, we've seen, whether that's in the United Nations, or we've seen that whether it's on sanctions or trade policy, or even some circumstances of geopolitics, sometimes India goes its own way. They're like, look, you guys can all believe what you want to do and force all these countries to do all these things. We're kind of going to be here in our own little sort of side of the playground. Let you guys have it out, because really it's not our place to get involved. We've got our own problems. We've got our own challenges. We've got our own path ahead of us. My relationship is to my people, and I'm going to go and do that. Now, how judicious is that to when you think about this being the world's largest democracy, and the fastest growing economy in the world, does that role now change? Does it say, well, you could do that before, my friends, but now you really can't do that? And say, when it comes to things like, a global sort of crisis on, say, a forced labor issue, or around a certain supply chain issue where we need countries to all align and help each other on a certain thing, will India then come to that table and sit on the right side of history? I think it's early days in telling that, and it's mainly because we just don't see a lot of collective wisdom on trade policy when you look around the world. It's always tit for tat, and it's always country to country or region to region. So I think India is going to play the country to country, region to region strategy for as long as they can. It might make sense for them to roll back tariffs in certain places, increase tariffs on other places, and participate in certain global pacts around climate, and maybe not some on other things as it relates to emissions. I was speaking to an Indian CEO not too long ago, and he said, I think it's so hypocritical how, say, the United States, during their time of revolution or industrial revolution, nobody questioned the United States at all when it came to their emissions or when it came to their, the highly pollutive industries that they were in to build an industrial economy. Nobody was their watchdog. But now, because we get our chance to do it and we're
Right.
trying really hard to do it, everybody wants to impose restrictions on us. And that's a bit hypocritical. And so I think perspective is so important when it comes to policy and when it comes to politics. And India, which is has a very, very antiquated and modern type approach to statecraft, is now asking themselves all these questions and using history as a learning lesson to say, hey, countries, take a little pause on what you're asking us to do. Maybe we all need to look back and see what our larger goals are before we start slapping each other's wrists or putting us on certain lists. And I think that conversation is just we have not seen the end of.
No, it's an interesting point and a valid one. I certainly think back to any of the reading that I've done about just the Gilded Age, right? Comes to mind. You wouldn't get away today with any of the things from a labor standpoint or an emissions. I guess the lesson is evolve before they invent the regulation that goes with the thing that you're doing, for better or worse. But absolutely a valid point and really an interesting time and an interesting place to be watching. Samir, I've so enjoyed our conversation, and I'm glad for anybody that had the chance to listen in and spend this time with us. If people are just meeting you for the first time, they would like to connect, they would like to learn more, what is the best way for them to reach out to you?
Well, it's Samir Kapadia. I'm on LinkedIn. The two companies that I've helped build, and we're doing some great work on supply chain and trade. One is called the Vogel Group, VOGEL. We're headquartered in Washington D.C, and we do a lot of work for companies that just need help on supply chain and tariffs and everything related to these government agencies. And the second one, which is really my passion, which is helping any U.S. company find a supply chain partner in India. All you got to do is go on to indiaindex.com and we'll help you find a supplier in seconds. So you can find me either on India Index or Vogel Group, but either way, I don't think I'm going to be leaving the supply chain business for a while. It's my passion. And so that's why I enjoy talking to people like you, Kelly.
Awesome. Well, Samir, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing all of your expertise, and hold on to your hats because it's not that long till November.
Thanks, Kelly. Appreciate your time as always.